The whine of a reciprocating saw sliced through the suburban morning quiet, a sound as jarring as a fire alarm. The camera pans slowly across a pristine, manicured lawn, the air thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and impending doom. A woman in a floral sundress, clutching a clipboard like a royal scepter, watches with a faint, self-satisfied smile as a burly landscaper slices through the last remaining section of a magnificent green hedge. The perfectly trimmed foliage collapses in a heap, revealing the once-hidden expanse of a neighbor's yard, and the furious, incredulous face of a man standing in the doorway, a coffee mug slipping from his grasp. The man's eyes, once full of morning peace, are now 2 chips of ice. His jaw tightens. He takes a single, deliberate step forward. Narrator, voice low and gravelly. She thought she'd won. The camera lingers on the woman's retreating smirk. She was wrong. Scene end. The silence was heavier than the humid July air. It settled over. The cul-de-sac like a shroud, muffling the distant chatter of sprinklers and the chirping of cicadas. What was once a vibrant, 10-foot-tall wall of verdant boxwood, a living fortress that had taken Ethan Vance over a decade to cultivate, was now a jagged, brutal scar. It looked like a giant had taken a bite out of the earth, leaving behind a trail of sawdust and splintered branches. The remains of his prized hedge lay in a sad green pile, a casualty of a war he hadn't known was being fought. Ethan didn't feel rage. Not yet. He felt a cold, unnerving emptiness. He walked out onto his lawn, the shards of his broken coffee mug a treacherous mosaic under his bare feet. He didn't feel them. All he could see was the gaping void where his privacy, his sanctuary, had been. He could see into the yard of Brenda Carmichael, the HOA president, a woman whose smile seemed to grow wider with every hedge branch that fell. He had lived next to Brenda for 5 years, and for 5 years, their interactions had been a series of polite but tense standoffs. He was a quiet, private man, a software engineer who cherished the solitude of his home and the quiet rhythm of his meticulously tended garden. She was a tornado of rules and regulations, a self-appointed dictator of the neighborhood aesthetic. Their properties were separated by the hedge, and for 5 years it had been a perfect, impenetrable barrier. "Good morning, Ethan," Brenda called out, her voice chirpy, almost saccharine. She was standing at the edge of her lawn, clipboard clutched to her chest, a triumphant general surveying a conquered battlefield. "I'm so glad we finally got to this. It's been on the agenda for months." Ethan's gaze shifted from the carnage to her face. His eyes were flat, devoid of emotion. "Brenda," he said, his voice a low, even rumble. "What have you done?" "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "It's all in the documents. Section 7, subsection C. All front-facing foliage must not exceed 5 feet in height to maintain a uniform aesthetic and ensure proper line of sight for street-facing properties. Your hedge was a safety hazard, Ethan, and quite frankly, an eyesore? An eyesore?" Ethan repeated, the words tasting like ash. He had spent countless hours pruning and shaping that hedge, ensuring it was a work of living art, a graceful shield against the intrusion of the world. "I believe I had a waiver for that." Brenda's smile didn't falter. "You had a temporary variance, which expired last month. I sent you 3 notices, Ethan. 3. You chose to ignore them. I'm just enforcing the rules." She tapped the clipboard with a manicured finger. "The board voted unanimously." The lie was so casual, so brazen, it almost took his breath away. The board consisted of Brenda and 2 other residents she had strong-armed into compliance. The votes were never unanimous. They were simply her will. "You could have come to me," Ethan said, his voice still unnervingly calm. "You could have knocked on my door. We could have discussed it." "There's nothing to discuss," Brenda stated, her tone shifting from sweet to sharp. "The rules are the rules. Now, the landscapers will be back tomorrow to remove the debris. You..." Have 7 days to replace the hedge with approved low-growing shrubs. I've already attached a list of compliant species to the last notice I sent you. The last notice. The one he had found stuffed between a flyer for pest control and a coupon for pizza. He hadn't seen it, hadn't noticed. The small, bureaucratic betrayal was just as painful as the physical destruction. If you don't comply, she continued, her voice gaining a condescending edge, I'll have to levy a fine of $500 a day per violation until the issue is resolved. She gave him a little head tilt, an expression of faux concern. We don't want that, do we, Ethan? He said nothing. He simply stared at the gaping hole where his hedge had been. He stared at her clipboard, at her smug, victorious face. The emptiness he had felt began to recede, replaced by something cold and hard and very, very precise. It was a clarity he had never experienced before, a sense of purpose that felt both terrifying and liberating. He turned and walked back toward his house, stepping carefully over the mug shards. The front door closed behind him with a soft, final click. Brenda stood for a moment, basking in the silence. She had won. She had shown him who was in charge. She was the one with the power, the one who upheld order, the one who made things right. She turned and walked back to her house, already planning the next infraction she would have to correct. Inside his house, Ethan Vance did not go into a rage. He didn't punch a wall or throw anything. He went straight to his office, sat down at his computer, and opened a new browser window. He typed in a single search query: City zoning ordinances for residential fences and walls. He wasn't going to replace his hedge. He wasn't going to plant any more shrubs. He wasn't going to argue or negotiate or plead. He was going to build a wall, not a simple fence, not something to keep people out. He was going to build a fortress, the legal kind. His fingers flew across the keyboard. He downloaded documents, cross-referenced codes, and studied diagrams. He learned about setback lines, material regulations, and building permits. He was a man of logic and systems, and in this moment, he was applying every bit of his brilliant, methodical mind to a singular, all-consuming task. He was going to build something so completely, utterly, and undeniably legal that Brenda Carmichael would have no choice but to watch. He found the key provision buried deep in the city's municipal code. There were height limits for fences, but not for privacy walls constructed from certain materials, as long as they were on the property line and met specific structural requirements. He found a specific exception for walls built for sound mitigation purposes. A slow, chilling smile crept across his face. Brenda loved her peace and quiet, the gentle hum of the neighborhood. He could justify a wall as a sound barrier. He could build it to be massive, imposing, and perfectly within the law. A monument to her arrogance, a symbol of his unforgiving will. He wasn't going to give her a list of compliant shrubs. He was going to give her a blueprint. He worked through the night, fueled by a single-minded focus that had replaced his shock and hurt. He designed a wall that wasn't just tall but thick. It would be made of dark, heavy-duty concrete with a smooth, unyielding surface. He found a contractor who specialized in large-scale residential projects, someone who wouldn't ask too many questions. He would fund it with the entirety of his savings. It was a debt he was willing to pay. As dawn approached, casting a pale, bruised light over the neighborhood, Ethan finally leaned back in his chair. On his screen was the final design. A 12-foot-tall, smooth gray slab that would stretch from the front of his property all the way to the back. It was a thing of brutalist beauty, a testament to his cold fury. It had no windows, no doors, no aesthetic flourishes. It was a wall and nothing else. He looked out the window at the pile of splintered branches where his beloved hedge had once stood. The first rays of morning sun were hitting the heap, making the cut leaves look like gold. He was a man who had built his life on order and predictability. But Brenda had introduced chaos. Now he would introduce a new kind of order, a finality, a statement that would silence her for good. He picked up his phone, his fingers hovering over the contact for the city's building department. His work was done. Hers was just beginning. The sun was a searing disk in a cloudless sky, beating down on the quiet cul-de-sac. 2 days had passed since the Great Hedge Massacre, and the landscape had changed once more. The pile of mangled boxwood branches had been cleared, leaving a raw, empty scar of brown earth where Ethan's sanctuary had once stood, but the void was not destined to last. Early that morning, a flatbed truck rumbled down the street, its diesel engine a coarse interruption to the morning birdsong. It pulled to a stop in front of Ethan's house, and a crew of 4 men in hard hats emerged, carrying a collection of surveying equipment, pickaxes, and rolls of what looked like heavy-duty wire mesh. They were followed by a small but powerful concrete mixer. Brenda Carmichael was at her window, nursing a cup of herbal tea, her brow furrowed in confusion. This was not the activity she had expected. She had envisioned Ethan, defeated and compliant in the local nursery, agonizing over which species of shrub to purchase. She had a list of approved choices ready to be emailed to him, a new violation, notice drafted and waiting just in case. But this was something else. This was a construction crew. She watched as the men methodically hammered stakes into the ground, a perfectly straight line that ran the entire length of Ethan's property line. One of them held a large blueprint, which they consulted with serious, professional nods. It was an ominous silence. No one was talking. They were just building. Brenda's composure, usually as unyielding as polished granite, began to crack. She put down her tea, her hands trembling slightly, and threw on a pair of sensible flats. She was out the door and on her front lawn in seconds. "Excuse me?" she called out, her voice a little too high, a little too strained. "What on earth is going on here? You can't just start a major construction project without a permit. This is a residential neighborhood." The foreman, a broad-shouldered man with a week's worth of stubble on his chin, looked up from his work. He didn't even acknowledge her directly. He simply pointed to a large, laminated sign that was now staked firmly into the ground near the street. Brenda's eyes narrowed. She strode over to the sign, her heels digging into the soft lawn. She read the words on it, her heart sinking with each line. Permit. 742B819. Project. Residential sound mitigation. Wall contractor Vance Concrete and Stone, Inc. Approved. City of Maplewood. Building and Safety Department below. The text was a detailed blueprint of the wall, 12 feet tall, 12 feet. It was a monstrosity. A gray, unyielding slab of concrete that would blot out the sun, his lawn, and his very existence. Her breath hitched in her chest. She couldn't believe her eyes. A sound mitigation wall. The sheer audacity of it. "This is impossible," she muttered. To herself, pulling out her phone and dialing the number for City Hall. "This is a violation of every single HOA bylaw." The city planner on the other end of the line was a man named Mr. Thompson. He was a professional, and he was bored. "I'm looking at the file right here, ma'am," he said, his voice flat. "Mr. Vance submitted the permit application 2 days ago. It was approved yesterday. Everything is in order." But the HOA bylaws," Brenda sputtered, her voice rising. "He has to get our approval. He has to submit architectural plans. We have rules." "I'm sorry, ma'am," Mr. Thompson said with an audible sigh. "But the HOA's bylaws don't supersede city zoning ordinances. As long as the structure is on the property line and meets all safety and structural codes, which Mr. Vance's design does, it's perfectly legal. The purpose of the wall, and I'm reading the file here, is for sound mitigation, which is a valid reason for such a structure. He's followed every procedure to the letter." He hung up, leaving Brenda standing on the edge of her lawn, the sign a stark, mocking monument to her failure. Just then, Ethan emerged from his house, dressed in a simple t-shirt and jeans. He didn't look at her. He didn't say a word. He simply walked past her, a blank expression on his face, and began to speak to the foreman. They pointed to the plans, and the foreman nodded in understanding. The men began to dig, the heavy thud of their shovels a dull, rhythmic echo of Brenda's own pounding heart. Brenda watched as they poured the concrete footings, a long, viscous line of gray sludge that would soon harden into the foundation of Ethan's revenge. It was a tangible, physical manifestation of his silent, cold fury. The humiliation was a hot, bitter taste in her mouth. She had wanted to teach him a lesson about rules and authority. She had wanted to bring him to heel, to force him to conform to her vision of the neighborhood. But he hadn't argued. He hadn't pleaded. He had simply gone and built a legal wall, a wall that was not only higher than her paltry hedge, but was designed to stand forever. She had created a void, and he had filled it. But he hadn't filled it with what she wanted. He had filled it with what he needed: his privacy, his peace, his retribution. The day ended with the crew laying the rebar, a skeletal steel framework rising from the ground. It was an intimidating sight, a promise of what was to come. It was a challenge, a declaration of war. Brenda stood on her lawn long after the crew had left, long after the sun had set, and the streetlights flickered to life. The rebar framework cast a long, grotesque shadow across her meticulously manicured flower beds, a shadow that would only grow with each passing day. She had wanted to control her neighbor's property, but now she had to stare at a monument to his defiance every single day. She had won the battle of the hedge, but he was winning the war of the will. And that was just the beginning. The next day, the concrete would arrive. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this was a wall she would never be able to tear down. The sun rose again, but it was a different day. The gentle suburban symphony of lawn mowers and distant play had been replaced by a new, more profound sound: the grinding, churning roar of a concrete truck. Its massive drum spun with a deliberate, relentless rhythm like the stomach of a hungry beast. The truck had arrived before sunrise, positioned perfectly at the curb. Its chute pointed toward the skeletal rebar framework that now stood like a steel skeleton on Ethan's property line. Brenda Carmichael watched from her bedroom window, her face pale in the morning light. She had barely slept, her mind a whirlwind of phone calls, legal threats, and impotent fury. Her conversation with the city planner had left her feeling hollowed out, as though the very foundation of her authority had been stolen from her. The HOA bylaws, her cherished rule book, were nothing more than a flimsy pamphlet in the face of municipal law. A second truck arrived, and then a third. A concrete pump was set up, a long, snaking hose extending from it, ready to deliver its gray, viscous payload. This was not a small project. This was a statement, a monument. Brenda watched as the first river of concrete flowed from the hose, enveloping the steel rebar, climbing higher and higher with a soft, sucking sound. The crew worked with an efficiency that was terrifying in its cold precision. They were artists in a brutal sort of way, sculpting a wall from raw earth and stone. As the hours passed, the wall grew. What had been a framework of possibility became a physical, unyielding reality. The neighbors, drawn by the sound and the sheer scale of the operation, gathered on their lawns. They didn't speak, not at first. They simply watched, their expressions, a mix of awe, confusion, and a quiet, nervous amusement. They all knew about the hedge. They all knew about Brenda. They had seen her at the last HOA meeting, where she had spent 20 minutes lecturing a new resident on the exact shade of green paint approved for mailboxes. Now, they were seeing the consequences of her iron-fisted rule, and it was a spectacle they couldn't look away from. Brenda could feel their eyes on her. She felt like a deposed queen, her crown slipping. She had spent a decade building her reputation as the unassailable leader of this community, the one who kept property values high and lawns manicured. But now, her authority was being poured into a 12-foot-tall slab of concrete, and everyone was a witness. Later that afternoon, Ethan walked out to speak to the foreman. He was a picture of calm, his hands in his pockets, a slight smile on his face as he surveyed the work. It was a smile Brenda had never seen on him before, not the polite, strained smile of a man who just wanted to be left alone, but a genuine, almost cruel curve of the lips, a smile of victory. She couldn't stand it. She had to do something, anything. She remembered the HOA bylaws, not for what they said, but for what they didn't. They didn't have to supersede city law. They could simply create new rules. She had to use her power in a way that couldn't be challenged by a simple phone call. She had to rally her people. That evening, a special notice was slipped into every mailbox on the cul-de-sac. It was printed on the official HOA letterhead, with Brenda's name and title in bold black font. Urgent, special HOA meeting tonight, 7 p.m. Topic: preserving the integrity and value of our community. Attendance is mandatory. The meeting was held in the Carmichaels' living room, which Brenda had set up like a tribunal. The furniture was pushed back against the walls and folding. Chairs were arranged in neat military rows. Most of the neighbors were there, their faces curious and a little apprehensive. Ethan Vance was not. Brenda stood in front of them, a PowerPoint presentation on her flat-screen TV. The first slide was a picture of a pristine, hedge-lined street. The next slide was a picture of a 12-foot-tall concrete wall. Neighbors, she began, her voice quivering with what she hoped sounded like controlled emotion. I am not here to talk about a hedge. I am here to talk about what that thing represents. She pointed at the picture of the wall. It's not just a wall. It's an act of aggression. It's a statement that one man's need for sound mitigation, which I can assure you is a frivolous claim, is more important than our shared vision of this community. Her speech was a masterpiece of manipulative rhetoric. She talked about property, values plummeting. She spoke of the children feeling unsafe, of the wall as a symbol of division. She framed Ethan's actions not as a response to her own, but as an unprovoked attack on the entire neighborhood. We have to act now, she said, her voice rising to a crescendo. We must make a new bylaw, a new rule that protects us from this kind of architectural terrorism. I propose we vote to create a special assessment, a fee to be levied against anyone whose property violates the spirit of our community, a fee that will go towards beautifying our neighborhood. A fee I propose of $1,000 a day. A collective gasp went through the room. $1,000 a day. It was a staggering amount, a financial punishment that would cripple even a well-off family. This will ensure that such rogue actions are never taken again, she said, her eyes sweeping over the crowd, daring them to object. I have drafted the bylaw, and I have had it reviewed by legal counsel. All we need is a simple majority. Vote. She held up a clipboard and a pen. Who is with me? She asked. A few hands went up. The couple who had moved in just last month, afraid of crossing her. An elderly woman who didn't want to get involved but felt pressured to agree. The silence hung heavy. Everyone looked at each other, uncomfortable, knowing that this was a power play, a move designed to crush Ethan and re-establish her authority. Then, from the back of the room, a voice spoke. It was quiet, but it cut through the tension like a razor. Brenda, the voice said, are you going to tell them why he built the wall? Everyone turned. It was Mr. Henderson, a retired history professor who lived 2 houses down from Ethan. He was a quiet, unassuming man, a widower who spent his days tending to his rose garden. Brenda's face flushed. That's not relevant, George. He built it without our approval, against our bylaws. That's the issue here. I think it's very relevant, Mr. Henderson said, his voice gaining a new, steady strength. Did you tell them you gave him a temporary variance to have the hedge, but then let it expire without a proper warning? Or did you just mail him a notice and then have it cut down when he wasn't home? Did you tell them you called the city and lied to them about it being a safety hazard? A murmur went through the crowd. Brenda's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Mr. Henderson walked to the front of the room, his old hands reaching for the remote. He clicked a button on the PowerPoint and the screen went blank. "What is relevant," he said, turning to face the group, "is that we are here because Brenda wanted to get rid of a hedge. A beautiful hedge that Ethan cultivated for a decade. She wanted to prove she was in charge. And now, we're all paying the price for her pettiness." He looked directly at Brenda. "He didn't build that wall because he wanted to be a bad neighbor. He built it because you gave him no other choice." Brenda stood there, exposed. Her elaborate trap had been sprung, but on her. All her careful planning, all her manipulative rhetoric, had been undone by one simple truth. Her authority, her carefully constructed kingdom of rules, was built on a foundation of spite. The people in the room weren't looking at her as their leader anymore. They were looking at her as the person who had brought a 12-foot-tall concrete wall to their neighborhood. And it was all her fault. The special HOA meeting ended not with a vote, but with a suffocating silence. The neighbors, faced with the stark, unvarnished truth of Brenda's actions, simply began to stand up and leave. They didn't slam doors or shout accusations, they just went, their goodbyes quiet and averted, each person a small walking indictment of her character. Brenda stood alone in the middle of her living room, surrounded by empty folding chairs and the ghost of her failed coup. The last to go was Mr. Henderson, who gave her a look of profound pity before closing the door with a gentle click. The silence that followed was 1,000 times louder than the concrete truck. It echoed through the house, a constant humming reminder of her public humiliation. She felt exposed, not just to the neighbors she had sought to rule, but to herself. Her authority, once a solid and dependable thing, had crumbled. The crown she had so carefully placed on her own head felt like a lead weight. She stumbled to the window, the same one where she had watched Ethan's concrete delivery that morning. The sun had long since set, and the streetlights cast a cold, yellow glow on the new addition to the neighborhood. The wall was complete. 12 feet of brutal, unadorned concrete, a perfectly smooth, dark gray slab that stretched from the sidewalk to the back of his property. It was a monolith, a monument to her defeat. It was not just a wall, but a tombstone for her reign. She couldn't see his lawn anymore. She couldn't see the perfect lines of his house or the meticulously trimmed beds he had so loved. All she could see was an impassive, unyielding barrier. The emptiness in her stomach was a gnawing thing, a hunger for retribution that had been denied. The feeling of being cornered was new to her. For so long, she had been the one dictating the terms, the one with the upper hand. Now, she was nothing. Just a woman staring at a wall. Ethan, meanwhile, was blissfully unaware of the drama that had unfolded just 2 doors down. He was in his workshop, soldering a circuit board for a personal project, the rhythmic sizzle of the iron a calm counterpoint to the quiet solitude of his evening. The wall was finished, a physical and psychological barrier that had, in just 2 days, restored a peace to his life that he hadn't realized he had lost. The silence of his backyard was now absolute. The faint sounds of Brenda's dog barking or the distant drone of her garden shears were gone. He felt as though he was finally home. The next morning, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Mr. Henderson. "Ethan, I wanted to tell you what happened at the meeting last night. Brenda tried to get a special assessment passed to fine you, $1,000 a day. But it failed. Everyone walked out after I told them what she had done to your hedge. I'm sorry you had to go through that. The wall is magnificent, by the way. Ethan read the message, a slow, thoughtful smile spreading across his face. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't planned on a public reckoning. His plan had been a simple, brutal equation, an action, a reaction, and a final physical solution. The fact that the neighbors had turned on her, that she had been exposed so completely, was a bonus he hadn't accounted for. It was a kind of justice, a karmic symmetry that pleased his logical mind. He didn't feel a sense of triumph, not a gloating one. It was something deeper, a quiet satisfaction. He had not only protected his peace, he had exposed the rot at the heart of her authority. He didn't text back. He just put his phone down and went back to his work. Brenda, on the other hand, was not finished. She spent the entire day cloistered in her office, her mind a furnace of rage and resentment. She was done with the HOA. She was done with the neighbors. The rules and the bylaws were useless against a man who had more money and more cunning than she had anticipated. She needed to hit him somewhere else. Somewhere the law wouldn't protect him. She opened her laptop and began to do her own methodical research. But unlike Ethan's, her research was not for building. It was for destroying. She looked up his name, his past addresses, his career history. She found his LinkedIn profile and his social media. She found old news articles about his company and the projects he had worked on. She found an article about a small local charity he was a major benefactor of, a charity for urban gardening and community beautification. Her eyes narrowed. This was it. This was the chink in his armor. He preached community, but he had built a wall. He was a hypocrite. The narrative was perfect. Brenda crafted a letter, not to the HOA, but to the local newspaper. It was a masterpiece of half-truths and insidious phrasing. She described the wall not as a sound barrier, but as a symbol of suburban selfishness. She framed Ethan's actions as a slap in the face to his community, a repudiation of everything the neighborhood stood for. She mentioned his prominent role in the urban gardening charity, subtly suggesting that his public persona was a lie. She included pictures of the wall, taken from a low angle to make it look even more monstrous and intimidating. She signed the letter, "A concerned neighbor," withholding name for fear of retaliation. Then she found the email address for the charity's board of directors and forwarded the letter, her finger hovering over the send button. She was going to ruin his reputation. She was going to make sure he was exposed as a fraud, a man who talked about community while building a concrete fortress to keep everyone out. She was going to hit him where it hurt the most, not in his pocketbook, but in his carefully constructed public image. She was no longer concerned with bylaws or fences. She was concerned with a war of words. And in that war, she intended to be the last one standing, her lips curled into a cold, triumphant smile. She had just found a new kind of weapon, one that was far more destructive than a saw. The newspaper hit the Carmichaels' driveway with a soft thud, a sound that, to Brenda, was a drumroll of triumph. She snatched it up, her eyes scanning the front page, then the local section. And there it was, under a small headline, HOA dispute, leads to concrete wall, questions raised about community values. Brenda's carefully crafted narrative was now public. The article, written by a diligent but credulous young journalist, quoted a concerned neighbor, Brenda herself, and described the wall as a symbol of division. It mentioned Ethan's prominence in the urban gardening charity, but subtly used the juxtaposition to imply hypocrisy. She read the words, a cold satisfaction spreading through her. This was the opening salvo she had been waiting for. This was a war of reputation, and she was armed. Across the cul-de-sac, Ethan was having a very different morning. His phone, which had been silent for days, began to buzz with a relentless urgency. The first call was from the CEO of his company, a friend, named Mark. "Ethan, did you see the paper?" Mark's voice was tight with concern. "What is this? This is insane. Our marketing team is already getting calls from clients. We have to issue a statement." Ethan, who had not yet seen the paper, felt a familiar, cold calm settle over him. He was a man who thrived on data and logic, and the sudden shift in his situation was, in its own way, fascinating. He told Mark to hold off on any statements. "Just tell them it's a personal matter. I'll handle it." The next call was from Maria Rodriguez, the head of the board for the urban gardening charity. Her voice was not tight with concern, but with cold, professional fury. "Ethan, I've just received a letter from an anonymous source," she said, her voice a razor's edge. "It details a feud with your neighbors that resulted in you building a 12-foot concrete wall." She also sent a copy of an article in the local paper. "I've told you before, our brand is about community. We literally call ourselves Community Roots. And now our biggest benefactor is being portrayed as a hypocrite who has walled himself off from his neighbors. This is a problem, Ethan. A serious problem." Ethan listened, his mind already working through scenarios, solutions, and counter-moves. He didn't interrupt. He knew that arguing would only make her angrier. "Maria, I understand completely, and I promise you, I have a plan. Just give me a day to respond." He hung up, walked to his front door, and picked up the paper. He read the article, a masterpiece of subtle character assassination. The image of the wall, taken from a low, dramatic angle, made it look like something out of a medieval fortress. He felt no anger, only a detached sense of admiration for Brenda's cunning. She had used a new weapon, one he hadn't accounted for, but he was a master of his craft, and every problem, no matter how complex, had a solution. He walked into his office and began to work. He didn't craft a scathing rebuttal. He didn't call a lawyer. He called a contractor. Not a concrete contractor, but a landscape artist. The best one in the city, known for his ability to transform mundane spaces into works of living art. He had a reputation for creating organic, breathtaking beauty. 2 days later, the sound returned. But it wasn't the sound of concrete mixers. It was a new sound, a gentle, rhythmic hum, the sound of a drone. Brenda, watching from her window, squinted against the sun. The drone hovered high above Ethan's property, its small camera pointed directly at the wall. Then another one arrived, and another. Soon, a small fleet of them was hovering over his property, their soft hum a strange technological chorus. She ran out to the lawn, her hands on her hips, her voice a sharp demand. "What on earth is that, Ethan? Are you spying on me?" Ethan emerged from his garage wearing a pair of comfortable work gloves and a wide, easy smile. He didn't yell. He didn't even address her. He simply walked over to the concrete wall, which was now a perfectly smooth, unblemished slate, and began to unroll a blueprint. It was a mural, a vast, intricate design that stretched from one end of the wall to the other. Brenda's jaw dropped. It wasn't just a wall. It was a canvas. The next morning, 2 men with paint sprayers arrived, not with cans of gray or brown paint, but with a vibrant palette of greens, purples, and blues. They began to work, their movements precise and deliberate. The drones hovered above, filming every stroke, every detail. Brenda watched in horrified fascination as the mural began to take shape. It wasn't a random design. It was a work of staggering beauty. It was a depiction of a vast living garden with sprawling trees, delicate vines, and bright exotic flowers that seemed to bloom and twist their way up the wall. There were birds and butterflies, and even a small, meandering stream that wound its way through the landscape. The colors were so vibrant, so lifelike, that it was easy to forget it was just paint. By the end of the day, the wall was transformed. It was no longer a symbol of anger or division. It was a breathtaking work of art. The neighbors who had been watching from their windows began to walk over, their cameras out, snapping pictures. They marveled at the beauty, at the sheer scale of the project. Ethan walked out to the street, holding his phone. He had just finished uploading the time-lapse video of the mural's creation. He had sent it to the local paper, to the board of the charity, and to every single person in the cul-de-sac. The video's title was simple: Rebuilding, Community One Brush Stroke at a Time. The article in the paper had painted him as a selfish isolationist. But now he had responded with a message that was undeniable. He had not only transformed his wall, he had transformed the entire narrative. He had taken Brenda's weapon and turned it into his own masterpiece. The next day, Ethan received a call from Maria at the charity. Her tone was completely different. "That mural is incredible, Ethan. It's beautiful. I'm so sorry, I should have waited before jumping to conclusions. The board is thrilled. We want to do a full press release, a fundraiser. We want to sell prints of the mural. Can you help us?" Brenda watched from her window, a cup of tea in her hand, but it had long since gone cold. The wall, her monument to his rage, was now his monument to his own genius. He had not only won the war, he had turned her most damaging weapon against her, and in doing so, had elevated himself to a new, heroic status in the eyes of everyone who had once sided with her. Her anger, her humiliation, had become the very canvas for his triumph.